And without further ado, this is, I'll hand you off to Gabriel Ciccone.
All right.
Gabriel.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Just let me actually do this. Okay, can everyone see? Oh, let me full screen this. No, not yet. Why is there not a way to have it be fuller screen? Oh, I guess that's probably good enough. Can everyone see this clearly? Yep, okay, cool. And can everyone hear me all right? All right.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, and all yeses in the chat. So you're
Fabulous.
looking good.
All right, so let's get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm so glad you're here to listen to me talk about some stuff. All right, so this is my training, Pursuit of Flappiness. And so I kind of wanted to start off with explaining how I got this slightly ridiculous title. When I was coming up with this, when I was thinking about doing this presentation, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do it at Peer Apocalypse. I need to come up with like a nice, clear title, something sensible and straightforward, but communicates what I'm gonna do. And absolutely under no circumstances can I have a ridiculous pun title. Not gonna do it. Then I was working on the proposal and I was chatting with a good friend of mine who's also autistic. And I was like, okay, I need to come up with a good title. I absolutely cannot call it The Pursuit of Flappiness. And my friend's like, dude, that's your title. I think you just need to go with it. And so I did. And then I kind of started to freak out about it because that felt a little uncomfy for me. And I realized that that was actually why I needed to have that be my title, because it made me uncomfortable. And so this is going to be a training that a little bit comes from my own perspective as an autistic person. And a big part of that has been sort of learning to unravel a lot of the shame I have around that. And hand flapping is like a behavior that's really highly stigmatized. It's often punished, seen as weird, all these things. And so I kind of liked the idea of challenging that and looking at it from a different perspective. That's a big part of what I'm going to be doing in this training. And this expression, the pursuit of flappiness, it's not unique to me. I've definitely seen it in many corners of the internet. But I really liked it and thought, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. All right, so this is an about me slide that's really just an excuse to have pictures of my really wonderful cats. The black cat is called Sammy, the gray cat is called Addie. They are the joy and light of my life. Sammy is actually sitting here in a basket on my desk. Here, hello, I interrupted his nap. And so I'm gonna be talking a little bit about my experiences with autism throughout the training, but I kind of wanted to start off by explaining some of the beginning of that. I started to pursue an autism diagnosis when I was in my late 20s, probably around 29. I'm 31 now. And so before that, I had a pretty long mental health history. I'd struggled a lot with various learning disabilities as a young kid. Then sort of college age, I had a couple of years of like a really intense mental health experience. I dropped out of college a couple times. I was hospitalized several times. At the time, I was given a diagnosis of bipolar disorder that sort of made sense at the time, but then really didn't make sense a couple years out of that experience. And then I kind of moved through that period of intense illness and kind of got my life back, and I finished college and I entered the workforce and I discovered peer support and I started doing peer support as a job, which I still do. And I loved it and I still do. And also I still had questions. I felt like there was something missing. I felt like I was still struggling with a lot of things. I'd always been told throughout my life that things would get easier as I got older. And that was true in some ways, and it was really not true in others. And so I had a lot of questions. I felt like there was something different about me and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And that's kind of what led me to pursuing an autism diagnosis. And then once I had that piece, so many things made sense. And I think this is something you'll hear from a lot of autistic people who are diagnosed later in life, that It made sense of so many experiences that I didn't have a way of understanding. Um, it kind of, all these things about me that I thought were broken or weird or damaged, it was just like, no, there's some different things going on. So that was super, super helpful. Um, and once I had that way of looking at autism that was different from the narrative that I had believed for so long, it felt like all of a sudden autism was everywhere. I felt like so many people in my life were all starting to figure out they were autistic. And I started to get really frustrated with how limited the understanding and the narrative around autism was. That me and so many other people had gone well into adulthood and not known something about ourselves. So that kind of led me to building this training to try and challenge some of those dominant narratives. We all filter things through a lens of our own experience. I'm no different. A different autistic person would create a different training and would approach this material differently, and that's okay. So that's kind of my perspective. All right, so why does this training exist? My goal here is just to kind of challenge some of the dominant narratives around autism and challenge some of those assumptions about what autism looks like, what it really means to be autistic, all of those things. There's a lot of material in here, so I'm going to move pretty fast, but there's also so much that I'm not going to cover. I could not do an exhaustive resource on autism if I wanted to. Just would not be able to cover everything. And actually, Roman, can you just confirm that this is being recorded? Did you hit the record button? I just realized that.
Yes, it is being recorded.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that that had happened. Thank you. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff in here, but it's not going to cover everything. I also just want to highlight that my goal here is not to shame and blame people. I'm going to be pretty critical of a lot of sort of mainstream perspectives. But I just want to emphasize we have so many of these dominant narratives that I'm going to criticize have been taught to us by experts, by the mainstream. I bought into basically all this problematic stuff that I'm going to tear apart. I bought into basically all of it until very recently. So my intention here is not to be you're bad or wrong if you have ever believed this or anything like that. Just want to acknowledge we all kind of go through a process of unlearning things that we realize are not accurate. So I just really encourage you all to practice self-compassion and have a little bit of grace for yourself if you do find yourself feeling defensive or that I'm being really critical. A quick note on language. So it's pretty common in the mental health world to use person-first language, but a lot of people in autistic self-advocacy circles follow a lead from the disability rights movement and use identity-first language. So throughout this training, I'm going to say autistic person or just autistic instead of person with autism. Those are the terms that I like to use for myself. Generally, my rule on language is I just try and use whatever that person is using if I'm interacting with another person, but that's what I'm going to use since that is the common term for a lot of autistic people and for myself. Most people see autism not as an illness that needs to be separated and have some distance from the person, but just a part of identity. So that's often where that comes from. And I also just want to highlight that sort of at first glance, some of the language that there's some differences in how mental health communities and autistic communities use language that I think at first glance can come across as maybe a little bit clinical, but I really don't think it is. It's just sort of a bit of a language difference. So I just want to highlight that. I'm going to talk a lot about that stuff as I go along, but I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar. A couple of definitions that I'm going to use throughout the training. Neurotypical, which is a descriptive term referring to normal cognitive, developmental, and intellectual functioning, or a person with those characteristics. Neurodivergent or neuroatypical, someone who is not neurotypical. This may include autistic people, but also may include people with other mental health or cognitive experience that deviate from the neurotypical norm. And then allistic is a slightly more specific term than neurodivergent because it specifically refers to someone who's not autistic. So an allistic person may or may not be neurotypical. Those terms often get used sort of interchangeably, and there's definitely some overlap, but I'm going to kind of use these terms. I also might use this a couple of times, assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth, to try to use some more expansive language that is inclusive of different gender identities, since we are going to discuss gender a bit. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so this section is going to be me kind of unpacking, well, not unpacking yet. I'm going to kind of explain the dominant narrative of autism. So this is kind of the way that it's sort of a framework for how we understand and talk about autism. It's sort of the unspoken set of assumptions and concepts that kind of undergird the like medical and social understandings of autism. All right, so this is the DSM definition that I'm not going to go over in super close detail, but I just kind of wanted to have this up here and kind of notice, and I kind of did the formatting here, so I put things in bold or in italics just to kind of pop out some of the big things. And this is a definition that really focuses on the ways in which autism deviates from like normative behavior. So it uses the term deficits a lot. This is the second set of characteristics. There's been a little bit more of an increased awareness of the sensory component to autism over the years, as opposed to focusing primarily on like the social differences. I'm going to focus a lot more on that later. But yeah, there's kind of been more awareness. So this section kind of focuses on some of that. So the dominant narrative, it's a really like deficits-based definition. It really frames all the characteristics of autism as deficits, as like negative deviations from that neurotypical norm. And so the next slide kind of proposes two different models, the medical model and the social model. I'm going to talk about the social model more later. In this slide, I kind of want to just focus on the medical model because that's kind of what we're going to be talking about now. So this is a great infographic on disability. So in the medical model, it says the person is disabled by the abnormalities and deficits of their own body and or brain. Disabled people are broken, abnormal, or damaged versions of human beings and should be fixed, cured, and or prevented. Since the disabled person impairments prevent them from functioning normally, they need caregivers and professionals to make decisions for them. The disabled person is the object of charity and receiver of help. The disabled person should adjust to fit into society, since they are the one who is not normal. Being part of society means rising above disability. So this is so often the framework that's kind of existing behind the scenes when we're talking about the dominant narrative of autism. And part of that is functioning labels. I'm going to kind of really challenge this idea of functioning labels later, but I just kind of wanted to provide like a sense of what people usually mean when they use functioning labels. And so often functioning labels end up being, okay, if you're high functioning, it usually means that you're verbal or mostly verbal, means you can live independently, means you have a job or could have one. Often when we say low functioning, what we mean is nonverbal or often nonverbal, needs support with activities of daily living and unable to work. Again, I'm going to kind of challenge these later, but I just want sort of like, these are things that we often use in the mainstream model. I also want to talk about some stereotypes of autism, since there's kind of like this medical component, like the DSM definition, to the mainstream narrative, but there's also this kind of like media narrative that like sort of trades in a lot of these stereotypes overtly or covertly. So there's often a sense that autistic people are always socially awkward, that their restricted interests are confined to particular things like video games, computers, trains, statistics, numbers, things like that. There's this idea that autistic people are self-centered or oblivious or lacking in empathy. There's a sense that they are sort of hyper-literal and can't understand language. And there's also kind of this sense, sort of like from the previous slide, that like either they're sort of a genius or a savant, or they're intellectually disabled. So that's kind of a lot of the stereotypes that we have of what autistic people look like. There's more cats. I'm going to use the cats on slides where I'm going to talk about myself, so you have cute cats to look at. And so the thing is, like, I bought into this dominant narrative and believed a lot of those stereotypes for a really long time. I never thought that I could be autistic because that was what autism was to me. It was like this very narrow set of characteristics that did not really match up to me at all. And so, you know, it had never occurred to me. It was just kind of like, okay, that's what autism is, because that is the only model I was given. All right, so let's talk a little bit about who creates this dominant narrative. And I use the present tense here intentionally. It's not the dominant narrative, even if it's coming sort of from the past, a lot of it, it's a living concept that's constantly being created and reinforced by society and by people. And the dominant narrative has largely been created and perpetuated by neurotypical or holistic people, particularly scientists, parents, media figures. Like, these are the people who are kind of controlling the narrative. All right. And who is being represented by the dominant narrative? So these are kind of the folks who are informing our definition of what an autistic person is. Quite often, those people are white, they're often male, they're usually children or young adults, they're generally straight or cisgender, often middle or upper middle class, and they're often diagnosed early, so diagnosed as children. And so that begs the question, that asks the question, who's being left out? Who is not being caught by this? So yeah, so people who don't fall into those categories are just often getting missed for diagnosis, which really ends up having a reinforcing effect on the dominant narrative, because our definition of what autism looks like is sort of based off of that narrow set of populations. And so I'm gonna kind of borrow from another social movement to explain how this happens and what the effect is. So here is a really great poster from the art collective Grand Fury from AIDS activism from the late 80s or early 90s. I can't remember exactly on what side of 1990 this was happening, but right around that time. And so the original definition from the CDC of what AIDS was as a syndrome was based off of how it looked in gay men. And so there were lots of women who had AIDS, but were getting slightly different opportunistic infections, or it was looking different in women than it was in this population of men that they were initially studying. And because of this, these women often went undiagnosed. And it meant that they frequently did not receive treatment. It means that they often were not eligible for AIDS-specific services or benefits, such as they were. It also meant that they weren't being counted in official case counts. And because women were undercounted, our understanding of how the virus was affecting women was really badly misunderstood for years, and almost certainly led to worse outcomes for women. So they use this really great slogan, women don't get AIDS, they just die from it. And so I kind of like to ask these questions. How do demographics influence definitions? And then how do those definitions reinforce those demographic expectations? And I think this can be a pretty useful comparison to autism, which has also been really dramatically underdiagnosed in women and girls. If we don't know what to look for, we can't look for it. And if we're not looking for it, we're not going to find it. So all this stuff is related. So the folks who are often being excluded from that narrative, again, women and girls, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are often get undiagnosed. Working class people or poor people who are not able to access a diagnosis, adults who've made it to adulthood and have not yet received one, and LGBTQ people, particularly transgender folks. A lot of people are not being able to access a diagnosis for a variety of reasons. Sometimes logistical and material, sometimes we don't have a sense of what to look for, and so people are getting missed. And to be clear, like, this is not that none of these people ever received an autism diagnosis, that's certainly true, but just that a lot fewer do. So our definition and our understanding of autism is sort of limited by that. All right, more cats. So I'm a transgender person who transitioned sort of later in life, in my late 20s, when I started identifying as trans. So I was growing up in the 90s and early aughties as someone that society saw as a young girl, and like no one was really looking for autism in young girls at that time, particularly if they were verbal and able to sort of function and doing okay. It was just kind of assumed that autism was really, really rare in girls. And it's funny, like now I look back at my school records and a lot of the records that my parents kept. And it's kind of amazing how quickly autism jumps out once you know what to look for. There was kind of a clear sense from everyone that there was something different about me, but no one really knew what to look for. And even though I was like, my parents did a lot of sort of diagnostic testing to try and figure out what was going on. And even though I was having a lot of trouble with like my peer relationships, had a lot of sensory stuff. I even found notes from my mom that literally said like, Gabriel doesn't understand social cues. All this stuff, like it just never came up. And I think a big part of that was that like no one was seeing that because they saw me as a girl and didn't really know what to look for. So I often wonder if I had been assigned male at birth and had been a little boy in the 90s, maybe someone would have picked up on that. I don't know, I have no way of knowing for certain, but I think that's a really interesting question. So yeah, these folks who don't conform to that narrative really often go undiagnosed. So I like to really think about like, what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences of that for those individuals, for our communities, and for our understanding of autism? What, you know, how do all those things relate? I'm going to use throughout this training a lot of really great webcomics. I've really tried to make sure that it's clear who created them. There's also, and if it isn't, I tried to include that in the slide. And I also have links to most of this stuff at the end of the presentation. But this is one that I found that I really liked. I think it really gets at some of the complicated feelings folks can have when they've made it to adulthood without having been diagnosed. And I certainly have like some complicated feelings about that, of what it meant to like grow up and get into basically my 30s, not having this. And, you know, maybe would have things been different if I had that understanding when I was a kid, and if people around me had that understanding. So what's being missed by this narrative? When we're only like thinking and understanding about autism through the lens of that dominant narrative, what are we not seeing? Often we're not seeing like the broad diversity of autistic experiences. We're often not seeing the strengths of autistic people. We're often not seeing the joy of autistic people. Often in some ways we're missing even just like the foundational humanity of autistic people. A lot of this can be used to sort of, sometimes very explicitly and sometimes in much more subtle ways, dehumanize autistic people. I think when we talk about autistic people like not experiencing empathy, I think that ends up being very dehumanizing, and that comes from like some misunderstandings of like what we mean by empathy and differences in communication styles. Okie doke. So this next section, we are going to start challenging this narrative a little bit by looking at things from some different perspectives. So my goal here is just to kind of challenge some of these basic assumptions that we've been having and just kind of provide a little bit of a different perspective. So I just want to ask, like, what's inherently normal about autism? What's inherently normal about being not autistic? And so by configuring autism as an other, the dominant narrative the dominant narrative really reinforces the idea that holistic behavior and communication, particularly as understood in the context of sort of white, Western, educated, middle-class culture, is inherently normal and good and correct. And is that really true? Why is that inherently normal and good and correct? So the next few slides, we're going to look at that sort of from a different perspective. All right, so I just kind of want to ask, like, what is autism saying about autism? Again, by defining autism as being a deviation from the holistic norm, that dominant narrative really reinforces the idea that the holistic behavior is neutral and correct. What would it mean to look at it differently? So I really like this meme that says, "Look at me, I'm a neurotypical. I give weird hints about things instead of just telling people." So I just want to think about the ways in which the rules for social communication are often pretty arbitrary and confusing. Autistic people are frequently seen as rude for communicating directly, and often are sort of judged for not conforming to really vague and arbitrary social conventions. And sometimes, and this is like a little bit of an oversimplification, I really like this meme because I think it's really evocative in a wonderful way, but like this is not necessarily true to my experience. I grew up in a sort of culture that was no one communicated directly, and so I never really learned to communicate directly. And I kind of, my struggle was when I grew up and was outside of my like general familial culture. I didn't have a way of like there was a different set of norms and expectations, so I kind of struggled with that. But I do really like this meme. So perspective matters. When we're trying to decide what is normal, our perspective and how we're looking at stuff, it really matters. So for this next section, I'm going to use a really wonderful children's book as an example. So this really delightful book is called Why Johnny Doesn't Flap. And this kind of like challenges some of those assumptions by providing a different perspective from the narrator, who's autistic and is unnamed, and his friend Johnny, who's a little bit different. So I'm going to show a few images from the book. So we have a lot of fun together, but sometimes he acts pretty strangely. Mom says it because he's NT or neurotypical. He doesn't have autism, so his brain works differently from mine. But that's okay. So already this is kind of flipping those things upside down. I really love this. So it says, when something exciting happens, Johnny doesn't respond like you would expect. He doesn't flap his arms or jump up and down. He just moves the side of his mouth up and slightly widens his eyes. Maybe he doesn't know much about how to express emotions. I just love how that kind of challenges the idea of how people respond. Like here we're configuring the narrator's response of jumping up and down and flapping his arms as like, that's normal. And maybe there's something a bit off about Johnny, and maybe he doesn't know how to express emotions because he doesn't respond that way. Johnny watches the same television shows that I do, but he never recites the opening credits word for word. In fact, I'm not even sure if he has them memorized. He sure picks funny things to focus on, but that's okay. Again, kind of looking at these different responses. So the other thing is like context matters. There's, so many things are considered sort of normal if holistic people do them in certain circumstances, but not when autistic people do them. So I found this great tweet that says, that kind of looks at how people act on The Price is Right and how that's, people will flap and jump and stuff, but they don't do it unless they're on The Price is Right. So I thought that was really wonderful. All right, so this next section is I'm going to try and explore some of the ways that autism can look beyond just that dominant narrative. So try and provide a little bit more context and information. All right, so I am going to try and reconfigure this narrative a little bit, and I'm going to look back at the DSM definition from a different angle, and I'm going to try and break it apart and explain it in some different ways. Right. Okay, so there's really just a huge diversity of autistic experiences and presentations, although there's a lot of shared characteristics that can manifest really differently in different people, and autism intersects with all these other different identity categories. And so we often say, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. It's not a neat, tidy category. So I just want people to keep that in mind as I go through this. I've really tried to kind of do my research and provide a diversity of opinions here, but this is certainly like informed by my own experiences. All right, so I'm going to kind of break down each of these things from the DSM kind of in this format, and I'm not going to read everything that's on the slide. And sort of in this section where I talk about the ways this can manifest in the dominant narrative and others, my point here is not that like the dominant narrative thing is wrong or inherently a stereotype. These are just usually the most common examples. And then I want to bring up some other examples of the thing in question that maybe are not talked about as much. And I've also kind of rearranged the DSM categories to look at in a different order because I think that helps provide a different perspective. I think one of the challenges I have with how things read in the DSM is everything kind of feels like it's separate and in a vacuum, and these things are all sort of interrelated, not necessarily in a causal sense, but just like they all kind of overlap. And so I kind of want to connect everything together as I go along. And so I decided to start with some of the sensory stuff because historically the focus has been on the social differences of autism rather than the sensory aspect. Now there's been increased focus on the role that sensory processing can play in autism. So many autistic folks have just a lower threshold for sensory information. Often how the brain is supposed to work in theory is that we kind of foreground novel data or information we're focusing on, and we background other data. For a lot of autistic people, everything is sort of foregrounded. So I can struggle a lot with background information or background noise if it's really loud. Because like the sound of a fan and the person I'm supposed to be listening to are like competing for space in my brain. And so that kind of can really contribute to this. And so there's lots of different sort of sensory processing difficulties. I specifically wanted to mention auditory processing issues, which a lot of autistic people, myself included, struggle with. And for me, sort of one of the big ways this manifests is human speech, particularly if there's background sound or if I can't see someone's face, just sounds a little bit like gibberish. Like it sort of sounds the way you hear like adults talk in a Charlie Brown cartoon. It's just sort of like, ah. And I can usually pick out a few words, and often I can sort of pick it up at a slight delay, but often there's like a split-second delay between me hearing sounds and my brain translating those sounds into words. And so people might be over or undersensitive to different kinds of stimuli and may either really struggle with or really enjoy different kinds of sensory input. One that I've always really struggled with is like, I can't stand chalk. I can't stand touching chalk. I can't stand touching a chalkboard. I can't stand the sound of chalk touching a chalkboard. Not even just nails on a chalkboard, which is also bad, but like literally anything having to do with chalk and or chalkboards. It even stresses me out to talk about it. That's like, it's almost painful, that kind of input. But there's some upsides to this, right? Like I think it often results in a greater awareness and analytical capacity to like understand the environment. All right, routines and repetition. So this is something that's often kind of seen as a negative thing and a weird thing, and there's not a lot of understanding about it. Just like, oh, autistic people are so rigid. But what this often actually is a coping mechanism. Structure and routine help a lot of autistic people make sense of an overwhelming and confusing world and help them feel secure in that. There's a really interesting theory of autism that I have linked kind of in the end. I'm not going to talk about it too much because it would take a lot of time, called the predictive coding theory of autism. And part of that is the idea that autistic people aren't always able to separate out sort of relevant information for building predictive systems in their brain, because that's kind of how our brains work in the world, is we kind of create these predictive models for understanding how things work. And for a lot of autistic people, they don't quite do that in a different way, in the way that sort of it's expected to happen. And again, that's something with upsides, but it also means that the world feels really unpredictable and really confusing a lot of the time, especially when you add in the sensory component. So a lot of things that maybe to a neurotypical person is just like, this is fine, everything is normal, I kind of have a sense of things, how they're happening. It may not feel that way for an autistic person. As such, routines and structures and a sense of predictability can really help someone feel secure. And when there's a deviation from that, it can actually be really distressing. I don't like when my routines get changed or when plans get changed, especially if it's kind of done at the last minute. It's like, no, we're going to do this, because having a sense of what to expect in a situation makes me feel secure in being able to handle it, because everything already feels overwhelming and unpredictable and stressful all of the time. So those routines and structures, like this is actually a great thing, right? This is a really helpful coping strategy for folks. And this can show up in a lot of different ways. We often talk about the concept of same food, so eating the same food every day or often, which can come out of like sensory sensitivities, but also providing comfort through routine. I saw that someone raised their hand. Did someone have like a question that needed to be answered right now or something?
It can be answered later. That's okay.
Okay,
I just wanted to mention that with my son being having autism, all that stuff really rings true. And we had to make things safe and predictable and routine in order to keep him happy. And then so when a change would come, that was devastating, right? It was just devastating, and we had total meltdowns. Um, but what I wanted to say was I find it interesting that during COVID, I'm more intentional about my routines than ever. And I've had that too, where I need predictability and safety and security, kind of all my life, but definitely in the last several months. So I just want to put that out there. I wonder if other people are feeling the same way. Maybe we're all a little autistic. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm gonna have time at the end for sort of more questions and answers. I'm happy to talk more with folks about that stuff.
Gabriel, another thing that I just want to bring up real quick. People are asking about copies of the presentation. Now, the presentation is being recorded, and maybe you can address that later if you would be open to sharing this with someone else.
Yeah, so I think I am planning on having the slides be available in some format. I'm not quite sure what that will look like yet, but it's definitely going to be, like, it is being recorded. At the end, I'm going to have my email address. I do want to make sure that, like, if this information is helping folks, I want to make sure that it's accessible to people. All right. So yeah, like we often, again, see this as negative, but this is often a way that folks are coping with the world. All right, so stimming. This is the term that we use in the autistic community for these sort of what are called either like self-stimulatory behaviors or stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. So these are the things like hand flapping, rocking, repeating words or phrases, can look a lot of different ways. I'm literally playing with a fidget toy right now. So stimming is amazing. It's a way that autistic people self-soothe. It's a way that we can regulate our emotions. It's a way we can manage distress. It's a way of communicating, of expressing joy and pleasure. And to some extent, everyone does some of this stuff, but it's generally more sort of common and frequent amongst autistic folks. And I also just kind of want to highlight that there's often been a focus on like trying to prevent or inhibit people from stimming, and that's actually really harmful for a variety of reasons. So we really I just kind of want to highlight stimming should not be prevented, limited, punished, unless it's causing active harm to that person, in which case the goal should be on shifting behavior to sort of non-injurious stims, not on punishing the behavior. And the reason I put an asterisk there is I just want to acknowledge like self-harm, self-injury, whatever term you want to use, is a thing. And I'm a pretty big believer in harm reduction and letting people kind of control like what their relationship to that stuff is. But so often there's this idea that we should be preventing people from stimming. And I just want to push back against that pretty clearly. There's some space for kind of if someone has self-injurious stims, helping collaborate with them to redirect to less injurious stims. But I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that talking about self-injury and self-harm is complicated, and I want to leave lots of space for that. Yeah, so stimming is just like a way that autistic people function in the world. And so I kind of want to relate back to the previous slides about how kind of all this is related. When your sensory environment is super overwhelming and when things feel out of control all the time, this is often a way that people can cope with that. and regulate and process their emotions. So it's actually like a super beneficial and helpful coping mechanism. Even beyond that, it feels good. People do it because like a lot of the times like stimming is a way of expressing joy and like deriving pleasure. Similarly, special interests. So these are, you know, from the DSM, it says highly restricted, fixated interests that are of normal in intensity or focus. So special interests are just a huge source of joy and meaning for a lot of autistic folks. They may be really long lasting. They may inform someone's hobbies and career choices, often result in people becoming experts in particular topics. I've had many, many special interests throughout my life. I always have like a bunch going at once. And has been great. Like it was super helpful for me in university. Like the AIDS crisis was a huge special interest of mine in college, which is how I kind of found that poster. And I ended up writing my thesis on AIDS activism. And because I had this like deep interest and joy in this topic, it really served me well. And similarly now, like I have a sort of have throughout my life have had a low-key special interest in maps, and I'm always really interested to know like the boundaries of things. And so I'm always the person who's like, yes, the county line is there, or like that's the edge of the school district. I love school district maps because you can find them online for free and they're super duper detailed and you can like dig into it. So great, love a good map. And these can take a lot of different forms. All right, communication. So, you know, here in the DSM, you have deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors, poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication. So autistic folks often communicate and interact in a way that is different from allistic people. Oftentimes, allistic communication relies really heavily on assumptions, on social expectations, context, subtle cues. A lot of autistic people might be more blunt or communicate in a more literal way. Often we rely on like social scripting of like having a script for a particular interaction, and may like have facial expressions that seem at odds with the social context, which could be due to overwhelm or sensory issues, but comes from a lot of different things. And so sort of in the dominant narrative, like we have this idea of autistic people being like really super hyper literal and like taking things literally. And so I never related this to me because I thought this meant that just like people weren't able to understand metaphors or idioms and like things like that. Like, you know, hearing it's raining cats and dogs and thinking like literal cats and dogs are falling from the sky. And it wasn't until quite recently that I realized like some other ways that this can show up. So I'm really, really specific in how I use language. It doesn't mean that I never misspeak or that like I'm just as capable of being full of shit as anyone else, but I really think a lot all the time about how I'm using language. It's very important to me to be very precise and specific. And I thought everyone did this. So like even in this first sentence in this column, I have autistic people often communicate differently. I would never, ever use that sentence without a modifier because that would imply that that's always the case under every circumstance. So every time I'm thinking about something, I'm asking myself, like, is that the most precise and specific way I could phrase that? And if not, I try and make sure that I'm using a modifier to include any potential exceptions to the rules. Again, I thought everyone did that. In the last few years, I realized that it's not true and it's gotten me into some trouble. And so it turns out that I took this idea of autistic people taking things literally. I ran into problems with that because I took it too literally. The irony of that is not lost on me. And so like having to translate from neurotypical to understanding what people are saying takes a lot of processing power. For me, depending on how much energy I have, like it may become really hard for me to understand. I'm often quite good at translating, but it takes a lot of mental energy. So social interactions. There's this idea of like deficits in social and emotional reciprocity. This can be part due to sensory issues. So sort of stuff we talked about at the beginning. If someone's having a hard time understanding what people are saying, or is overwhelmed by the environment, it might be hard for them to like participate in a normal way. Might struggle to conform to sort of like normative ideas of social reciprocity, might not always understand like when to jump in, or how to kind of communicate in that way. But the other big thing is that autistic people, our different communication style has often resulted in rejection, bullying, shunning, which can often end up reinforcing communication difficulties because people are often really like scared of being rejected. And so that can kind of reinforce some of these problems too. So like all this stuff is kind of interconnected. And similarly, there can be this idea that autistic people are cold or aloof, or self-centered. We often just communicate differently. Like two pretty common things is autistic people often try and build rapport with people by sharing about ourselves, which often can be read as being self-centered. Similarly, talking about a special interest or like info dumping is often a way that people like try and build rapport with someone of like, oh my gosh, I love this thing so much. Don't you also want to hear about like this really great map I found? All right. So relationships. There's this idea that autistic people have deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. And so this is in some ways sort of the culmination of all these things. Often autistic orientation towards others and resulting communication styles is just different from that holistic norm. There's this really pernicious myth that autistic people don't experience empathy, which is not true. Often autistic people experience like greater degrees of sort of emotional empathy than a lot of people, but can sometimes struggle with perspective taking. So understanding the way in which people might think differently from us, even if we're really good at understanding how they might feel, or feeling their emotions. And this is sort of to my example about language. This is something that I can sometimes struggle with because sometimes it doesn't occur to me that other people don't use language that way because it's so logical to me. And so these, communication difficulties often result in challenges with relationships. So you kind of have this idea that autistic people don't have friends or don't want friends or don't have close relationships. But that's often not true. Like lots of people have, many close friendships or may like have just a few, but feel very satisfied by them and have them be like deep and full and robust emotional connections. Okay, so I want to kind of link all these things together with an example from my personal life that I think shows the way in which all of this can be connected and how that shows up in people's lives. So about a year ago, I started seeing a new therapist after my old therapist was leaving his practice, and it ended up not working out. We kind of made the mutual decision that like the relationship was not working. And I kind of figured out both over the course of those few months, and particularly afterwards, the ways in which our really different communication styles and like the way my autistic self and her lack of understanding contributed to this. And my goal here is to not like rag on or criticize this therapist. I actually have a lot of empathy for her. But we ended up it was not working. There were so many things that were contributing to this. So I'd gotten some really good feedback from the previous therapist who was super supportive and aware of like autism and that kind of stuff. And something I had noticed over time is that when I am thinking or confused, particularly when I'm trying to translate from neurotypical, I make a face that a lot of people read as me being angry. I am not angry, I am thinking, or my brain wheels are spinning, or I'm confused. And so I told this new therapist this on day one, like, hey, if you see me make a face that looks angry, this face, I'm not angry, I'm thinking. And so also her office was on a really busy street, so there was lots of street noise all the time, always cars going back and forth. And that was really overwhelming to me because my brain can't filter that out. It was just as loud, like it was just as foregrounded in my brain as her trying to talk to me. So that kind of made it hard. And then, our communication styles were about as different as two people could be, like even more so than sort of me and the norm. by her own admission, she was not very precise in her language, just didn't always think about those things. And so I was like constantly perplexed because to me, she was always contradicting herself. It didn't really make sense to me, I think, and I would ask a lot of clarifying questions, which I think sometimes to her would feel like combative or argumentative. But to me, like, she was saying things that didn't make sense. It wasn't logical in any way, and I wanted to understand. And so that kind of contributed as well. And then I would make my thinking face because I was thinking all the time and my brain wheels were spinning, but she would see that as anger. And towards the end of our working relationship, she told me that she was having a hard time because I was angry all the time. And I was so confused because I thought I'd been very clear that I wasn't angry, I was thinking. And I don't know if she forgot or something, but I was trying to figure out, like, okay, what went wrong? I was so clear and this didn't land for this person. So I did a little research by spending a lot of time staring at my bathroom mirror and making facial expressions. And I figured something out. The way that facial expressions are pretty contextual, how we interpret them, and the way that we communicate anger and confusion are very similar. It's all in the eyebrows. And so the face that I make when I'm confused reads as confused if someone's expecting me to be confused. I saw her make exactly the same face when she was confused, and because I was expecting her to be confused, I knew that she was confused and not angry. But because she wasn't expecting me to be confused, because to her what she was saying is perfectly logical, she was seeing that as anger, because, you know, it looks similar. And so this just kind of led to this, like, and we just kind of got more and more entrenched in our perspective. I was feeling like really upset. I actually found it all mildly traumatizing. And I think in some ways she did as well. Because there's just like two ships passing in the night, like just going past each other. Even though I had really tried to communicate very clearly with her about what was going on, you know, it didn't land. So I think that's hopefully a helpful example of how all these things can result in these like miscommunications. All right, we're gonna kind of move quickly along because we still have quite a bit to cover. This is gonna be pretty quick. I just sort of want to talk about some of the intersections in a way that autism intersects with other things. So it's really common for autism to overlap with other health conditions, whether they be physical, mental health, developmental. There are others as well. I just kind of picked some of the big ones. So it's pretty common for these things to overlap. Similarly, it's pretty common for autistic people to be LGBTQ, particularly for autistic people to be trans. We don't necessarily know why this is, and actually I would argue that it's not super relevant, maybe doesn't matter that much. What matters more, I think, is that these are two already vulnerable populations, and being at the intersection of them is often results in people being particularly vulnerable. Like, I am generally not upfront about being autistic when I am interacting with the medical community in my capacity as a transgender person of trying to access healthcare, because I know often autistic people are denied access to transition because there's this idea that like they can't really be trans or maybe shouldn't be making their own choices and don't really understand themselves. So that's like a real cause for concern. And it's just kind of been interesting in my own experience how many people I know who are autistic and trans. Like, there really just seems to be a lot of overlap. And so just kind of something to think about of what it means to exist at the intersections of those identities. And I also just kind of want to highlight trauma, both in like the big ways that we often understand this, but just the small ways in which being autistic in an unsupportive world is traumatizing. The trauma of an overwhelming environment, the trauma of disconnection, and just like the trauma of not being seen. I think this is just a huge one for so many different experiences, when people aren't seeing you as yourself. And even worse in some ways, when you don't have a framework for understanding yourself. I think I really struggled with not having language for a long time to understand myself, both as an autistic person, but as a transgender person. Like, I did not have those labels. There's no way of understanding those experiences. And that can be really traumatizing. So I think this is a really important thing to think about always when working with autistic folks. And so sort of relating to that, I kind of want to talk about the disabling world, the way in which autistic people are sort of disabled by their environment. And so we're going to kind of look at the social model of disability. So we kind of talked before about the medical model. And this is just like a framework, a way of looking at the world. And in the social model of disability, the source of disability is less about like the actual deficits of that person's body or brain, and really more about society's inability or refusal to accommodate those differences. So it kind of says here, the person is disabled by their environment and the physical, attitudinal, communication, and social barriers. The disabled person should be supported by society. Disabled people are normal, valid variations of human beings. Since the disabled person is inherently equal, they have a right to autonomy, choice, and free and informed consent in their own lives. So this is just a helpful framework to have in our mind as we go through this. So I have used several comics from the autistic comic artist, Steve Aspel. He has a comic strip called Stimmy Kitty that's amazing. I have a link to it at the end of the presentation. And here we have Stimmy sitting under a sign that says out of order. And I love that this turtle lady says, "You're not out of order, dear. It's the rest of the world that's all out of order." So this is kind of a really good explainer of like the social model of disability. And so I want to return to the idea of functioning labels and talk about, what we're actually talking about when we're talking about functioning labels. And I want to recognize that like we often use these as a shorthand. I even use them sometimes like with scare quotes just because it's so entrenched in how we talk about things. So when I kind of dig into this and pull it apart, I'm understanding that like often these are just terms that we use without intending to be harmful. But I kind of want to really pick at some of the really pernicious assumptions that are living underneath this. So really kind of what we're talking about here is assimilation versus exclusion. People who are seen as high functioning, of which I am a person in that category, often have the really real challenges and struggles dismissed. Often we're kind of seen as like neurotypical light, or just like normal people, but quirky. So real challenges and struggles that someone has often are not being recognized and accommodated. I am a person with a full-time job. I live alone. I drive a car. I pay all my bills on time. To the surface, I seem like very like able to do all the things. And there's lots of very basic human things that are extremely hard for me and that I really struggle with. But that kind of often doesn't get seen. And the flip side of that is the people who are seen as low functioning often have their really real strengths and abilities not seen, entirely missed, dismissed. And often they're just totally sort of dehumanized. This idea if someone is not able to speak or needs a lot of support, that person is not a full human in some way. And so we often kind of see the spectrum as this line with high functioning on one end and low functioning on the other. And I kind of want to break that apart. So I'm going to kind of challenge this. So often what we're talking about here is high functioning person is just sort of like the least autistic. They can or should pretend to be normal if they try hard enough, that they are a productive member of society, or could be, again, if they tried hard enough. And this idea that low functioning people are the most autistic, that they are abnormal, deficient, drain on society even, just this idea that they're this binary and people kind of get shoved in one or another. And again, my point is not that like every person who gets put into one of these categories has these assumptions attached to them, but this is kind of stuff that's existing underneath the surface of all these things. So here's another of the Stimmy Kitty cartoons that I really like, that kind of gets at the idea of spectrum as a straight line versus, and like just how that's an oversimplified narrative. So I'm going to kind of talk about a few other ways in which sort of the society and the world can be disabling for autistic people. So masking. Masking is a concept which is basically the practice of disguising one's autistic traits in an effort to appear neurotypical. So this could mean making eye contact or pretending to make eye contact, even if it's uncomfortable. This might mean sort of performing normalcy or like kind of performing a particular sort of social script. It might mean avoiding stimming, all of these things. And to some extent, everyone masks, like we all do code switching. We all have ways of like kind of performing normalcy in particular environments. And also like masking is not inherently awful in every circumstance. Like there's reasons why we do it, and there's ways to like, you know, adjust some things but still be true to yourself. But I do kind of want to talk about some of the costs of masking when you are like so forced to do that, or even for like people who have been undiagnosed for a long time. Sometimes like it's hard to see the line between the mask and the self because you're just so used to hiding all of these things and knowing like, okay, I can't do these things in front of people, or just didn't learn to do them at all. And so there can be a lot of costs associated with really heavy masking or when you don't have a lot of control over it. And we're going to talk about some of those. So we're pretty familiar with the concept of a meltdown. And I kind of want to frame the meltdown as like an externalized response. And then I want to talk about the flip side of the meltdown, which is the shutdown. I don't really ever experience meltdowns, but I have shutdowns a ton, which can look really different for different people. For me, it often just means not being able to communicate verbally, sometimes not even being able to move. A more mild shutdown, I might be like still participating internally in an experience, but my face looks really blank. I may have a harder time making words happen. I just don't have the power to like run the Gabriel machine at full speed. And that often happens when I'm in a like overwhelming sensory environment or I'm really just tired or overwhelmed. But also I can have like a much harder shutdown where like I literally cannot move or speak at all. And my brain is still fully engaged, fully running, fully like participating, but I just can't respond at all, which can be challenging. It once happened at an airport in the like TSA security line, and that was not a good situation. So sort of relating to that is this concept of autistic burnout, which can look really different for different people, really sort of broad general category. But often this can come about when autistic people are having to do a lot of masking or are in a really autism and unfriendly environment or just really stressed and overwhelmed. Often a mixture of all of these things can just kind of result in a lot of struggles and often sort of even a like decline in functioning. And this I think was sort of what led me to pursuing an autism diagnosis. Was I kind of got to a stage in life where I felt like I wasn't able to do some things that I used to be able to do as well or at all, and just like felt like I was just kind of really always struggling. So I think this is a helpful concept. And here's a comic sort of related to this. All right, so just kind of want to briefly talk about autistic joy as a concept. So much of the narrative around autism is really centered around suffering and distress. And it's not that these things don't exist, but like, what are we missing when we're focusing on that? And often we're missing joy. Autistic people often have a really tremendous capacity for joy. If we think back to the book Johnny Doesn't Flap, about how the narrator like experiences joy compared to Johnny, who just like kind of smiles when the ice cream truck comes, whereas like the narrator is like jumping up and down and having a good flap about it. And this is like really one of my favorite things about being autistic. And I also think it's one of my great strengths, both as a person and as a peer support. I love that I get to show like enthusiasm and joy for people and their interests. And I feel like even in my like most difficult times, even when I'm really, really struggling or really sad or all of the things, I feel like I'm still always able to experience joy. And I really love that. Here's another great comic from Steve Askell. And I love, like, if you look at the last panel, it says, "Why is that girl rocking? She has autism, so sad." But if you look at Stimmy, like, she's clearly having a great time. Like, I absolutely love the way he does the background and how beautiful that is and illustrative of, like, the joy that can come from stimming. And similarly, special interests, I think, are just a wonderful source of autistic joy for a lot of folks. And here we have Stimmy talking about her love of botany. And like for me, like I mentioned earlier, this is just like a huge thing in my life and always has been. I love that I can get really excited about maps. And I've had, you know, quite a few special interests over the years. I can tell you probably everything you could ever want to know about Antarctic exploration between the years of 1901 and 1922. I could also certainly tell you many things you probably don't want to know about that. Similarly, I've had a long-standing special interest in the history of fashion, which is cool because I can generally date any like Western painting or photograph pretty accurately because I just know exactly how to interpret what everyone's wearing, and I just kind of have a memory where it's just like, okay, that means that year, and I really love that. All right, okay. Last section is going to be kind of focusing on coming up with a new narrative, a new way of thinking about autism. And I'm going to be using some really wonderful comics from Jenny Bristol and Rebecca Burgess. Again, that's going to be linked at the end of the presentation. All right, so the first framework I kind of want to have is difference over deficit. So the dominant narrative really focuses on the ways in which autistic people are deficient compared to the neurotypical norm. So what if we understood autism not as a deviation from a norm, but a set of differences that were not inherently negative? And what if we also saw allism not as like the norm, the standard, but just like another category? And so the term we often use is a neurotype, comes from like phenotype or genotype. And if we think about like biodiversity, the idea that there's all these different ways and forms for life to exist and how there's so much diversity like within a species and how that's actually a huge strength. Autism is part of the natural variation of human experiences. That neurodiversity is actually like a huge strength of humans. We benefit from having that diversity of experiences. And my point here isn't that there are never any like negatives or challenges to autism, but that like we can't only be looking at things as negative because there's always strengths and deficits. So here's one of these really great comics. Kind of says autism isn't an illness. I really love the section here. It says, my brain isn't broken. It's just not suited to a neurotypical world. Both of our brains work great in different ways. Sorry, I keep having to move the thing with everyone's faces so I can see the slide. So rather than trying to fix us when nothing actually needs fixing, seek to learn from us about ourselves and the world as we are. All right, acceptance over awareness. So historically, the emphasis has been on autism awareness, drawing attention to autism as a condition and focusing on ways of treating or even curing autism. This framework sees autism as something that needs to be conquered and eliminated. What if we shift the narrative of autism to one of acceptance? And so one of the like driving forces behind the sort of awareness model has been organizations like Autism Speaks. If you listen to a lot of autistic adults, they will be extremely critical of Autism Speaks. And they have received a lot of criticism from autistic advocates for focusing on a cure, centering the experience around parents and not really including autistic people within their organization, and putting very little of their funds into like actual support for autistic folks. And I kind of bring this up just as a data point, but also because it's kind of going to show up in the next comment. So if we think about acceptance, autistic people don't need to be changed, fixed, or cured. We need to be accepted as we are and supported to thrive as active members of society. So this narrative, this comic kind of challenges the idea of awareness. And the colors here are important. This flashlight on the left says awareness, and this flashlight, and it's blue, and the flashlight on the right says acceptance, and it's red. So Autism Speaks uses, has April as Autism Awareness Month and uses the like hashtag or term light it up blue And autistic self-advocates have pushed back against that by using the hashtag red instead to try and focus on acceptance rather than awareness. So that's kind of what's going on here with the colors. And so I think it's really helpful to think about, like, how can we seek to understand the motivations so you'll understand the child or adult. Here's another comic. Acceptance makes it easier for us to help ourselves, can minimize the stigma that might prevent adults from seeking a diagnosis. A diagnosis helps us understand ourselves better, including our strengths and challenges. Self-understanding provides us additional tools to navigate a tricky world. I just really love, like, there's so much texture going on in these cartoons, and I really love them. So inclusion over assimilation. Often services for autistic people have really been about making autistic folks change their behavior, even totally harmless or beneficial behavior, like a lot of stimming, so as to better conform to society. And so from this, you get things like ABA, or applied behavior analysis, which is often seen as like the standard therapy for autistic people, but has received a ton of pushback from autistic adults who have been through it as something that is really profoundly harmful and damaging, because it really centers on focusing sort of on compliance, and sort of the ultimate goal of ABA is to try and train autistic children to not have as many autistic behaviors, even things that, again, are harmless or beneficial. And so the inclusion kind of idea is, like, what if we instead sought approaches that really allowed autistic people full participation in society without requiring them to, like, foundationally change major parts of who they are. So thinking about the ways autistic people could be included and integrated in society in a way that accommodates their needs without requiring them to assimilate. So acceptance really allows us to be our best selves and take care of our physical and mental health, rather than using therapies that squelch our natural behavior and coping mechanisms, just so that those around us can feel more comfortable. Realize that these therapies are unhealthy for us. Society often forces us to conform. Our ability to thrive often relies on acceptance. By accepting us as we are and taking our stated needs seriously, we're able to practice the kind of self-care that maintains good mental and physical health. All right. And acceptance leads to integrated support. By accepting autism as something that is a natural part of who we are, it'll be easier to implement integrated supports for autistic people. Even if we become good at masking our autistic traits to fit in better, we're still the same people. We can't keep the mask up for long. We need those supports. And so self-advocacy over paternalism. So often, historically, holistic parents and professionals have really dominated the conversation around what autistic people need. And I'm not saying that, like, there's no place for these people. I think autistic parents can be, or sorry, parents of autistic children, whether or not they are themselves autistic, can be really amazing allies in this journey. But often, so much of the narrative has centered on parents and professionals to the exclusion of actual autistic people. So what if we saw autistic folks as experts on their own experiences? Autistic self-advocacy allows us to reclaim that narrative. When autistic people are in positions of power, we have the ability to make really real improvements in our own lives and lives of others. So this slide kind of gets at this exactly. I really love this. If people truly wanted to help us, seek to understand, not control. And I think, like, this is also a great analog to the peer world, like the whole concept of nothing about us without us. Like, this is that. And so, yeah, kind of focusing on, like, allowing autistic voices to be a big part of the conversation. We have things to say, not just about ourselves and autism, but about the world. And so where do we go from here? This is kind of the end of things. And I really hope that this training kind of provided some different perspectives and gave you some things to think about, and just and again, like I said at the get-go, you probably still have a lot of questions, and that is okay. My point here was just to kind of give us things to think about and provide a framework to look at things in a little bit of a different way. And sort of think about, okay, how can we move forward to support autistic people and center autistic voices and sort of move towards a world that really centers autistic community and autistic joy. So thanks for listening. I have a little bit of an autistic train joke in here because I can. I also have my email address. I will be very blunt. I am historically very bad at responding to emails, but please feel free to email me if you want to talk about this stuff. Happy to, I really love sort of talking with folks about this stuff and happy to talk and collaborate and whatnot. So feel free to contact me. All right, so I'm gonna unshare and I know we're almost at time, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions and talk to folks if that would be helpful.
Gabriel, thank you. Thank you so much. And in monitoring the chat, there were some questions that came up. More of books. So, some that said for the end, and I wanted to find that there are a lot there. If you can scroll and maybe find some too.
Yeah, I'm also looking through the chat now that I can.
There was a lot of discussion, and I'm glad that you guys had that discussion and encouraging each other and helping each other out as well. That's what we need in this community as well. I also have 2 children on the autism spectrum, and so I totally understand and I appreciate your I'm trying to decipher through some of these so how about
oh, sorry, go ahead, Roman.
How about 3 to 5 year olds who do you give them free? How do you give them freedom to in self-injurious stimming? I think we just covered that a little bit, and there was. Go ahead.
No, I didn't quite hear the whole question.
How about with 3 to 5 year olds? How do you give them freedom in self-injurious stimming?
I'm not quite sure what that question means.
Did you want
I don't know if the person who asked it wants to clarify.
Is that Kristen? Do you want to unmute yourself and clarify maybe a little bit? If you're still here. Perhaps.
Oh, okay. I'm looking at the question now instead of looking over it. And yeah, I think it's a tricky question with like really young children. And I'll be honest, like I don't have a lot of experience with super young children, so I want to like hold that as a lack of knowledge on my part. And I think like so stimming is often like a way of coping with difficult environments. And I think sometimes if we can work on making the environment and our way of approaching like less stressful, sometimes that means like less sort of self-injurious stims or less meltdowns. So sometimes you can approach it from that lens. And then, yeah, I think some other people provided some.
Yeah, there was a good conversation. If you look at the question just before that from Martha, in providing support, what are some ways to differentiate from severe OCD when building trust, rapport, and mutual relationship?
That's a good question. I think like autism and OCD often have a lot of overlap, as I mentioned. I experience both things. I'm pretty familiar with living at those intersections. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that in terms of like ways to differentiate. So I don't know if the person who asked that question wants to elaborate more, but I think there's lots of space to talk about the ways in which those things are similar.
Okay, scrolling down a little bit.
So I asked that question about OCD just because we were sort of on that portion of your presentation, and it was called out as being similar. I think some other attendees also weighed in on that. But I'm thinking of like some of the more severe OCD, and would it be helpful to become just more informed so that when I'm working with folks that are wondering about, you know, I have one peer I'm working with and he wants to wonder about being on the spectrum as he defines it.
Mhm.
But when he speaks those words, people within our organization start to plan for removal of certain services for him and moving him to a different program. And he needs those more wraparound services. So I feel like it silences his voice in a journey to have a better understanding about his experience. And they're wanting to put, if you will, a different diagnosis on it. So he can, he could, like, they can check the box for him, So I was just wondering, like, how could I support him in his quest to differentiate and really be genuine in his experience without wanting to call it like one thing or another? And it sounds like what you're saying is oftentimes they just overlap, and all that is OCD and the variety of experiences around that.
Yeah, I think like there is a lot of overlap. And I think that's a really interesting and important question, because I think that's one of the challenges of an autism diagnosis, of having that label that can sometimes have unwanted consequences. Even though like having that label is so helpful for a lot of people, it sounds like that's the example you gave is one where that would have consequences. And I think like that's a space where informed consent, like all things, is really helpful, of being able to like work with someone of like, hey, getting a formal autism diagnosis could result in this, that, or the other thing. I'm seeing, hearing you and understanding your experiences. And I like, that sounds like it's really helpful for you, but I just want to be clear about like what some other people are saying, and just kind of having a really upfront, honest, and like collaborative conversation about that, while also like advocating for that peer within your workplace, of like saying, hey, why would we remove all these services if like someone is still having all these experiences and this stuff is still true, but maybe there's also an autism piece. Like, why would that have to mean changing all the things?
I would like to encourage people to do groups, start groups around, well, I support one, I facilitate one that's bipolar support group. We call it bipolar rollers. It's kind of cute. But sharing experiences and learning from others is really important. So, I think we should have more peer support groups where these are understood or explained or questioned, so people that have questions can gauge some of that through visiting with other peers.
Yeah.
And I have a Voices, Visions, and Extreme States group that does that beautifully, and just want to support those and encourage those.
Yeah, and in the slides, which I said I'm gonna hopefully make available, I have a whole bunch of like further reading. So I did include like the links to the comics. I included some resources, like some really great videos, some great autistic writers. I tried to provide like a lot of different resources for people who want to learn more. So that's all going to be in there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, there was a question that for the end, for movies, documentaries, videos, and such related.
Mm-hmm.
There was another one, question for the end. Let me find that one. If I can find that one.
I'm sort of scrolling through too. And if people want to say questions out loud, I'm happy to answer.
There we go. Question for the end. Do you have any recommendations for books or videos to watch in regard to autism and sexuality? The ones I find seem to be more directive to being straight and not being open to any other sexualities.
I don't have a ton off the top of my head. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the autistic writer Lydia XY Brown, who have a link to their blog in the ending slides. And they have a lot of conversations about the intersection between like autism and gender. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I'm trying to think if there's other stuff. I think also just like Twitter and Tumblr can be really great resources. And you can find a lot of perspectives from different people that can be helpful. But yeah, so there is actually a book that I got from the library, but really didn't read much of, so I can't necessarily vouch for, but it seemed good, that was specifically about autistic trans people, and it was written by an autistic trans person. So I have hope for that. I keep meaning to actually read it one of these days. And I can't remember the title or the author, but the title was like very straightforward. I think it was like Autism in Transgender People or something like that. That was like pretty straightforward.
There is one here that says, could you talk a little more about what kinds of peer support spaces there are for people who are autistic? I don't know much about this and would be really interested in resources to look into or any information you can share. Thank you.
Yeah. So I know that there's an organization called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. That's all like autistic folks in self-advocacy. I'm not sure if they have, I'm not sure if there's a local affiliate. There might be. I can't think of any other sort of specific autistic peer things off the top of my head, although I do think they exist. And so I think often when I'm kind of looking for that stuff, I just sort of dig around the internet and really look for places where the focus is like, if it talks about being run by autistic people, or kind of being centered on those experiences. Again, I don't have any great answers off the top of my head, but there is some stuff there.
Wow, well, John Parsons actually stated, I help facilitate 2 autism support groups. They are very different. I enjoy the different space of each group. That's awesome.
That is awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you all so much for listening.
So we've run a little out of time, and like half the people have jumped off. Thank you for staying on. This is very important to me, I'm sure, and to you as well, Danielle, and everyone who stuck around.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. The Oregon Self-Advocacy Coalition. That's great.
There you go. Well, I guess since we're the very few left here, is there any other questions? Just chime in, unmute yourself real quick, if you're okay with that, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm happy to talk to anyone else or
we want to be aware of time too. So if then some people have their schedules. So
how do we access the videos? How do we access this training later? They
will become available after Peer Apocalypse. I'm not quite sure, maybe a week or 2 after. Yeah.
But then, so what website or whatever do we go to get
pureapocalypse.com? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
I apologize if I missed it. I did enter it as a question in the chat. Where do we find more of these illustrations and cartoons? I absolutely adore them.
Yeah, so they're all going to be linked in the slides. And actually, you know what I'm going to do really quickly is...
I mean, is there a particular artist or are they yours?
No, so these are, I included credits for all of them. So these are all coming from artists. They're definitely not mine. I'm going to screen share again. Oh, I thought it did. So I included all of this. These are the comics that I used at the end for like all the acceptance versus advocacy, or acceptance versus awareness. This is Steve Aspel's Stimmy Kitty comics. And I included some of the other ones. And there's a few other comics that I didn't include here at the end, but in the slides themselves, either in the comic itself or I put specific credit, I said where it was coming from. I wanted to be, I like really love those comics and I think it's so helpful to explain, but I wanted to make sure that there was a clear link back to whoever was creating it, because they're definitely not mine. And there's-
Ask an autistic person, I like that.
And I have some further resources and things. I have some other articles about like autism at identity intersections. There's some really great writing from Black autistic people. So I really wanted to kind of give some further information. So that's all going to be in the slides.
Hey, Gabriel, could you go back one slide?
Oh, yeah, let me.
Thank you.
And Amethyst Schraber's Ask an Autistic Person videos are amazing. They have, it's sort of in a video format on YouTube, and they provide a lot of definitions, they answer a lot of great questions. So that's a really wonderful resource as well.
She's transitioned from doing that now in more to a social platform, and she doesn't do it that often now. But yeah, you can look it up. There's a lot of stuff to learn just from Ask an Autistic. She covers stimming and a whole lot of other. It's great.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you show the one where the autistic burnout web link is? Thank you so much. Amazing presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad people liked it. I think it's the next one. Yeah. And I find this website, Spectrum News, it actually tends to have some really good articles. They have a really good breakdown of predictive coding. I found this super helpful.
That's the magazine, right? Spectrum?
Yes.
Yeah, Spectrum's. Yeah.
Gabriel, I would like to get in contact with you and have you actually speak to one of my groups sometime in the future, because it's a lot of stuff you touch on, especially when we talk about being transgendered and sexuality. That's been an issue that has came up because I do see a lot of that in one of my autism groups. And it's, they're just trying to be, I mean, they're looking for acceptance for who they are. And it's like, they get hit on one side by one community for being a certain, and they're, the other community is like, well, you're autistic, you're not like us. And, and so they get it from all sides.
Yeah. Oh, my email address is there. I'm happy to talk with folks, and yeah, I'd be glad to do that.
I'll get with the therapist that runs that group, and I think she'd be really excited about having you. So I'll reach out to you and
awesome.
Set something up.
Daniel, did you want to share your email in the chat?
Oh yeah, I can do
so
that.
that way it might be easier.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I'm not always the greatest at communicating via email, but I really do like talking with folks. And so if you ever want to have a more involved conversation, I do a lot better either over phone or Zoom. So if you do want to talk more and would be open to doing that, that can sometimes be better for me. Sometimes folks will send me a beautiful long email and I'll want to respond, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It's just not the way that I communicate the best. So I just want to flag that for folks. If I don't respond, it's not because I'm mad at you or disinterested. It's just not the best way for me to communicate, and I'm just not always up on that stuff.
Right.
But I do want to be available for folks as much as I can.
I'll send you an email with a contact number. That way you can call
Yeah.
them.
There you go.
So, yeah, I'm pretty aware. I hate talking. I don't even like talking over Zoom. I'm a kind of a face-to-face person. This whole social distancing has been driving me crazy, but I get it though. I'm going to keep people safe. So yeah. So thank you very much. That was a great presentation.
You're welcome. I'm glad folks liked it.
I was trying to decide between two different ones, and I'm glad I think I made the right choice for what I do. So
yeah, I was hoping we'd have a little bit of a larger group, but you know what? We had a really wonderful group here. Thank you so much for all coming. And yeah, this will be all.
Martha is clapping.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's all going to be recorded and available. So feel free to share with your networks if you found it useful and want other people to look at it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Is that about it?
Anything else from anyone?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to talk with folks. And thank you so much for coming and listening and participating.
Everyone have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.